Today I am dealing with the parts, the connections, and the functions of thalamus. In the recent textbooks of physiology, the description of thalamus is not extensive. It is just given in a paragraph or two in Genong or Guyton. Here is a picture of the brain. In this picture, you have these two oval structures. These are the thalami, and these are what is called a diencephalic structures in between the brain and the brain stem. And the green one is the hypothalamus. Let us know what is the meaning of thalamus. In the Greek word, thalamos is referred to an inner room. Here I have written antapura. Antapura, you understand that Sanskrit component of that word. That means inside the house there is especially the palaces, we have the antapura where the queens are being stationed, or in Urdu word janana, the queens or begums, they stay. Okay, so that is the inner room. And as for the Greek word, it is commonly a bridal chamber or bridal couch, used in reference to marriage, consummation, and the continuity of a tribe. This word appears in Virgil's works. He's a poet, he's a Latin poet, BC, and he has described this word. Okay, that's what about the meaning, and I just take a small point from that. It's an inner chamber or a meeting place that is called thalamus. Here is the thalamus. So these thalami, there are two thalami, paired oval gray matter of the diencephalon. And if you are looking at this thing, it is almost in the center of the brain. You just see that this is the inner core of the brain. This is the entire cerebral cortex. You can just see that. You see the almost in the center of the brain. So located near the center of the brain, and it is above this. This is midbrain, above midbrain. And if you are looking at the diencephalic structures, includes thalamus, epithalamus, subthalamus, hypothalamus. So now you have all those structures. Maybe here is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland here. This is the hypothalamus. Anyway, so this thalamus being the diencephalic structures, it is above the midbrain and just underneath the telencephalon or the forebrain. Only thing that this thalamus is centered in such a way that it communicates to the entire cortex. Entire cortex freely, it is freely available to be communicated to the entire area. Okay, so now a brief anatomy of the thalamus. This is a horizontal section. You just see that this is a horizontal section. This is expanded part of the horizontal section, and these blue areas are the two thalami on either side, and you have this part forms the third ventricle, and here is the lateral ventricle. This is the lateral ventricle. The green part is the caudate, part of the caudate nucleus. Okay, so that means the same thing here, and this is corpus callosum. That is where two hemispheres connect. So you just, these two hemispheres are connecting each other here. This is corpus callosum, and here forms this is the third ventricle. Here is the pineal gland, and we have the other structures of the diencephalon. Okay, these are oval mass of gray matter. Already I mentioned below the corpus callosum. between the telencephalon, that is a forebrain, and the mesencephalon, the midbrain. Rostrally, lateral ventricle, and a caudal part of third ventricle. So rostrally means above, this side is a lateral ventricle, and this is the caudal part of the third ventricle. Is interconnected. So this part is interconnected. We have the intrathalamic adhesions here. Maybe in the next section you will see it better. Caudally and inferiorly thalamic nuclei diverge. So they separate out. You just see that they are getting diverged. And the subthalamic structures seen, that is the pineal gland, hypothalamus, subthalamic nucleus, and both colliculi are seen, and other midbrain areas. The laterally, so here we cannot see the lateral thing. Here we can just see the laterally. So this is the lateral component, and this is the internal capsule. Now again, we come back. These are the two thalamic structures, and these two thalamic structures, the medially they are interconnected. They are interconnected by the intrathalamic adhesion, and the thalamus forms the upper lateral walls of the third ventricle. So this is the third ventricle, upper and the lateral wall of the third ventricle, and these are lateral ventricles. Okay, and this is the internal capsule. This is the internal capsule. Laterally limits the posterior arm of the internal capsule. Anterolaterally limits the head of the caudate nucleus. This is the caudate nucleus. This is the caudate nucleus. And ventrally with the subthalamus and hypothalamus. Here downwards we have the subthalamus and hypothalamic structures. Okay, now what are the functions of thalamus? It's a crucial crossroad structure in the brain, and it is a major contributor to the following functions. One, sensory perception. Sensory perception, say it, the sensation. Yes, it is included, excepting olfactory sensations. And it is doing the attention. So that means your attention, whatever you attain, because it is connected to the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. So it performs the function of attention. So that means you focus, you gaze, you try to be attentive, alert, so on. Important for the arousal and a sleep-wakeful state, sleepful state of the individual. So that means through the reticular projections. And it is being associated with the memory forming and memory storing or memory consolidation, mammillothalamic tract. That is where the hippocampus, the limbic system, cingulate cortex, they are all associated. So that is the memory formation. So then cognition, that is the learning and trying to associate many of the functions. And this cognition is the ability to learn, that is the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus and other somatosensory association areas. They will perform. Thalamus performs an important motor function because it relays the cortico-striatal, then striato-pallidal, pallido-thalamic, and the thalamo-cortical projection. So in one word, cortico-basal ganglia cortical loop, cortico-basal ganglia cortical loop, that is the motor function it performs. So that means premotor cortex gives it to the basal ganglia. From the basal ganglia, it is processed and gives it to the thalamus, and to the thalamus back to the motor cortex for performing an action. Similarly, lateral part of the cerebellum is connected with the premotor area, and that is also a cortico-cerebellum, thalamic, and the cortical projections. It performs the visual functions through the lateral geniculate body. This is the part of the thalamus dedicated for the visual relay. And medial geniculate body is the part of the thalamus dedicated for auditory pathway. So before it goes to the auditory cortex, they are relayed here. All the cochlear inputs, they are relayed here in this. So that means it performs all the sensory perception. I have just given these things. Now, let us move on. Thalamic nuclei can be divided at least 3 types. One category of nuclei, that is gray matter, that performs sensory thalamic relays. Whatever we were trying to talk about the sensory relays. So all the somesthetic sensations, the visual sensation, auditory sensations are relayed in the thalamus at a particular dedicated areas. So these are sensory relay stations. That is one part. Only exception is olfactory nerves or olfactory sensation. Then we have a second category relays. These are higher order thalamic relays. The higher order thalamic relays, they process information from many cortical inputs. And these cortical inputs in association with the thalamus and sent back to the cortex, Thalamo-Cortical networks. So especially the cortical inputs are taken and then sent back to the prefrontal cortex or the hippocampus, and then for learning, memory, and several other functions. So that is the second category of a higher order function of the thalamic relay. Third category is a non-specific thalamic relays. These non-specific thalamic relays start from a thalamo-cortical projections from the internal medullary lamina or the external medullary lamina to all the cortices. And here these layers, it will be relayed into layer 1 of the outer molecular layer of the cortex. The entire cortical mantle and these dendrites, they are being activated, and this is responsible for these thalamo-cortical projections coming from these internal medullary laminae and external medullary laminae are responsible for our arousal response. Suppose if these are cut, the arousal response is not there. So that means it's a coma. So these are 3 different categories of relays in the thalamus. These are called thalamic nuclei. Now, just look at that, how the thalamus is organized. It's a oval structure. First of all, you see a beautiful pear-shaped or oval egg-shaped, oval sex. This thing. We have this typical Y. Typical Y. This is the white matter. This is the white matter. This is the internal medullary lamina. So that means you make this oval structure, and in this structure you have this Y. So that is internal medulla, and this is you have the other one is also, other thalamus is also like this here. So now this is the medial part, this is the anterior part, and this is the lateral part. This is the anterior gray matter, the medial gray matter or nucleus, and the lateral gray matter. On this side, especially on the lateral side, we have white matter. The dark one is the white matter, and this white matter forms the external medullary lamina, and this external medullary lamina receives the thalamo-cortical and corticothalamic fibers. So because whatever the fibers originating from these nuclei, these gray matter, how to reach the cortex or to their destinations, and that could be achieved through these fibers. And you have this one is almost capped in the reticular nucleus. So there is that means there is one more nucleus, that is a reticular nucleus. So I have mentioned here white matter, the external medullary laminae, internal medullary laminae. This is internal, this is external. The gray matter, the anterior gray matter, the medial gray matter, and the lateral gray matter. Now, you just I want to bring back the same structure here. This structure just you see that the same thing, a Y-shaped structure. This is the internal medullary lamina, and this is the medial part. This is the lateral part. You have the, and this is the anterior part. And this anterior part is capped by the reticular thing. So this is a reticular, or the, and this forms the external medullary lamina. So now this is divided into number of nuclei. So maybe in the next slide I take it. So okay, you can see this number of nuclei. You can just see that this red one is the internal medullary lamina, and this part, the medial part, the red part, and this median part is where interthalamic connections are taking place. This is the medial nucleus. This is the medial nucleus. And this dark one here, or black, is the anterior nucleus. This is the anterior nucleus. This yellow part, the entire yellow part, is the lateral nucleus. This lateral nucleus, maybe I just read, this is divided into the ventral anterior, ventral anterior, ventral lateral, and ventral posterior. This is ventral posterior nucleus. Okay, so that means if this lateral part is divided in the posterior side, this is anterior, this is posterior side, here is the pulvinar area, very broad area, and then after you deduct the pulvinar nucleus, this is the pulvinar nucleus, and you just cut this thing here, so you have a lateral posterior and lateral dorsal. And when you make a line like this, and you have ventral anterior, ventral lateral, and ventral posterior. And ventral posterior is divided into ventral intermediate, ventral posterior medial, ventral posterior lateral. Ventral posterior, I have made it here. The ventral posterior is divided into 3 nuclei, ventral posterior lateral, where we see that the medial lemniscal bundles are related, ventral posterior lateral. Ventral posterior medial, where a trigeminal bundle or trigeminal area and a gustatory area, they are coming up here. The ventral posterior medial and ventral intermediate. Then we have the medial geniculate body. This is the medial geniculate body, and this is the lateral geniculate. Just to tell you, this is the medial nucleus. This is the intermedium, that is the interthalamic adhesion, anterior, lateral. Lateral is divided into 2 segments, lateral dorsal and lateral posterior, and the ventral. In the ventral, ventral anterior, ventral lateral, ventral posterior. And the posterior part is a pulvinar, and then we have a MGB and a LGB. Okay, so now looking, see the color, these things are very clear here. So looking at these things, so now we look into the medial thalamic nuclei. These are the medial thalamic nuclei. These are also known as the dorsomedian nucleus. Dorsomedian. So actually, these are medial thalamic nuclei. So they are also called dorsomedial, ventromedial. The ventromedial and the dorsomedial parts. So dorsomedial nucleus has a 2-way connections with the prefrontal cortex. I have made an arrow here. This nucleus is a 2-way connection to the prefrontal cortex, hypothalamic nuclei, and all other groups of thalamic nuclei. All these thalamic nuclei are connected here. What are the functions of this dorsomedian nucleus? If you are looking at this, this is concerned with the prefrontal cortex and hypothalamic nucleus, and to an extent it is also connected with the olfactory system and other areas of the limbic system. The medial part of the thalamus is responsible for integration of a large variety of sensory information, including somatic, visceral, and olfactory information together. They will try to give a meaning to that translation. And it correlates these information in persons, producing emotional feelings and subjective states. Just for example, if a painful sensation is there, and this painful sensation, that particular behavior we have about a pain, the rejection or aversion or a fear or a phobia, and all those emotional parts, because this is coming here, the pain is coming here in the ventroposterolateral, and this one communicates to this medial group, and this medial group with a prefrontal cortex and hypothalamic nuclei, and produce a reaction to that pain. Like that, even a proprioceptive inputs or the visual inputs, so on. This is about medial thalamic nuclei. Now, anterior thalamic nuclei. So this is the anterior part of the thalamus. This anterior thalamic nuclei receive inputs from the mammillary body. So that forms the mammillothalamic tract. Other name for the mammillothalamic tract is a Wick-de-Azyr. I will just mention it in the next slide. The Wick-de-Azyr. It has a reciprocal connections with the cingulate gyrus and hypothalamus. This is cingulate gyrus here. It has a reciprocal connections from the cingulate gyrus, and it has the reciprocal connections with the hypothalamus and also the hippocampus. Cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, the limbic areas, the hypothalamus, many more. The functions closely associated with the limbic system, concerned with the emotion and recent memory interactions. Suppose you have reacted to a person because of certain incidents, and that reactions now they are hanging on, and they are in your mind. They keep on reminding you that you did wrong, or he did wrong, or who did wrong. So you always think to analyze, and you try to think back, and you try to bring back. And this type of memory, the recent behavioral interaction you had, so that is happening here in this. And this is performed by the Papage circuit. The Papage circuit. What is that Papage circuit? This Papage circuit, I repeat, it starts from the entorhinal cortex. That's the hippocampal cortex. Then hippocampus, the mammillary nucleus, the anterior thalamic nucleus, cingulate gyrus, back to entorhinal cortex. Here it is. Maybe in the next slide it is very clear. So it starts from here. This is entorhinal cortex. So from the entorhinal cortex, it goes to the hippocampus. This is hippocampus. And from the hippocampus, it reaches to the mammillary nucleus. This is the mammillary body and the mammillary nucleus. So that means you just see that hippocampus, it goes around. This is the mammillary nucleus through the fornix. This is the fornix crux and fornix body, and this is coming here. From the mammillary nucleus, so this will go to this is the anterior thalamus. This is the anterior thalamus. This is thalamus. And this part, so the mammillary body or mammillary nucleus to the thalamus, the anterior thalamus, this is known as a mammillothalamic tract or a mammillothalamic bundle, or also known as a Wick-de-Azyr. Wick-de-Azyr. Okay, so now this fiber, the importance of this fiber. So then in vitamin B1 deficiency or in chronic alcoholics, these fibers will degenerate, and these fibers are necessary for the formation of the memory because they are associated with the, look, if you are going further, they are associated with the memory formation. You will have the loss of memory. I will come back with that. So from the thalamus, it will go to the cingulate cortex. This is cingulate cortex, and this cingulate cortex, this comes back to comes back to hippocampus and entorhinal cortex. Comes back to hippocampus and entorhinal cortex and again repeats. So that means it is the peptide circuit. The peptide circuit starts with the entorhinal cortex, the hippocampus, the mammillary nuclei, anterior thalamic nuclei, cingulate gyrus, back to entorhinal cortex. This is the peptide circuit. So this is one of those behavior circuits. That is what I was trying to talk about. Suppose you have recently interacted with some individuals. This interaction may be a positive interaction or a negative interaction. Positive interaction means you have liked some person and you feel that it was awful, and you say that, okay, wonderful, I liked the lecture, something like that. So that particular information moves from the entorhinal cortex and hippocampus, and it tries to go through these peptide circuit, and it is actually to consolidate it as a memory, or it is actually to store it in the memory in the hippocampus. That is the purpose. So the hippocampus do not want to forget that wonderful event, or do not want to forget that painful event. So something like that. These two things, the two extreme things I'm trying to put in, these two things are being operated through the peptide circuit. So this is peptide circuit. I repeat, it starts from entorhinal cortex. This is entorhinal cortex, then hippocampus. From the hippocampus through the fornix, reach the anterior thalamic nuclei. This is the to reach the mammillary nucleus. So from the mammillary nucleus, mammillothalamic tract, that will reach the anterior part of the thalamus. From the anterior part of the thalamus, it goes to the cingulate cortex. This is cingulate cortex, and this is corpus callosum. This is corpus callosum, cingulate cortex, and from the cingulate cortex, it will be back, because these fibers are coming in this direction. It would be back to the entorhinal cortex and to the hippocampus. So this circuit operates several times repetitively for the consolidation of the memory. Now, what are the functions of the lateral thalamic nuclei? Because we consider the medial thalamic nuclei, we consider the anterior thalamic nuclei and their connections. The lateral nuclei are subdivided into two groups, dorsal group and ventral group. This is a dorsal group. This is a ventral group. So this dorsal group is subdivided. Now I'm taking this, the green one. The dorsal group is subdivided into lateral dorsal, lateral posterior, and pulvinar. Lateral dorsal nucleus. So this is for behavioral assessment, because if you are looking at the lateral dorsal nucleus, this lateral dorsal nucleus is nearer to the anterior thalamic nucleus. Now the anterior thalamic nucleus is connected with the hippocampus, the mammillary body. Similarly, this lateral dorsal nucleus is connected with the amygdala and other limbic structures, the cingulate cortex. This is for the behavioral assessment and adjustments. The lateral posterior nucleus, this part, this is the lateral posterior nucleus. This assists, or this helps the pulvinar, the gauging, that is focusing, the head and the neck orientation for a particular action, and it will also get the information from this ventroposterolateral and ventroposterior medial. This part, they would just try to project onto this thing, and they will try to have the posture and equilibrium. So this is lateral posterior, and this is the large mass of gray matter here. This is a pulvinar. This pulvinar, it gets the visual, the collicular, even the temporal, and even the somatosensory association from the somatosensory association areas. And this receives inputs from all that, and that would try to have the eye, head, neck movement. Eye, head, neck movement. So that is what the pulvinar nucleus does. Now, the connections, if I were to think about the connections of this green mass, the pulvinar is connected to the superior colliculus and collicular structures and other thalamic nuclei, because it gets it from here, lateral posterior, it gets from here, and even from the median that receives the pulvinar. Lateral dorsal, this lateral dorsal I mentioned, it receives inputs from amygdala, the hippocampus, the olfactory nucleus, the limbic, cingulate cortex, the spinothalamic, reticulothalamic, all the projections here. Because if you are looking at lateral dorsal nucleus, it is for the behavioral assessment and behavioral adjustment. Now, if you are looking at the lateral posterior, it receives inputs from other thalamic nuclei, just from lateral dorsal, from the ventral posterior, from the pulvinar, and it receives the interthalamic nuclei, and it receives the inputs from the parieto-occipito-temporal area, the somatosensory association area, so as to help the pulvinar in performing the actions. This is about a dorsal group of lateral nucleus, lateral dorsal, lateral posterior, and pulvinar. I mentioned the lateral dorsal is behavior, lateral posterior head neck orientation, and gazing. Gazing means visual fixation of the visual axis. The pulvinar is the visual fixation, the collicular, that is the orientation in space, the head and neck movements in reference to the inputs. So these are the functions. So now what I missed here, the medial geniculate body and the lateral geniculate body, and these medial geniculate body and the lateral geniculate body, they are for auditory and visual inputs respectively. So other part of the lateral nucleus are this yellow area, and these are the ventral group. These are ventral group. This ventral group is divided into, I mentioned, ventral anterior, ventral lateral, and ventral posterior. Ventral anterior is connected with the basal ganglia, the globus pallidus, DPI. The globus pallidus interna communicates to the ventral anterior. And the ventral lateral receives inputs from the cerebellum. It receives inputs from the cerebellum. And what I am trying to put you here, so there will be a mixture of information coming from the reticular system while coming. It may connect to the ventral anterior and ventral lateral, but primarily this is a basal ganglia input, this is cerebellar input, the ventral lateral. Then ventral posterior, this is the entire thing is ventral posterior. Ventral intermediate is a gustatory taste sensation. Ventral posterior medial, this is a trigeminal input, a trigeminal sensation, that is the face and whatever the sensations carried by the trigeminal nerve. So then this is VPL. This part is VPL, and this VPL is the somesthetic sensation of the entire body. The medial lemniscal or lateral lemniscal organization. So this is about the nuclei of the ventral group. And also in this ventral group, we have the lateral geniculate body and for visual, and a medial geniculate body for auditory sensations. Now, thalamic nuclei, thus we can decide, or we can define them as a specific relay nuclei and association nuclei and non-specific nuclei. Here in this table, I am trying to give the overall idea about the specific relay nuclei. So because I have classified them into specific relay nuclei, the association nuclei, and the non-specific nuclei. And if I am specific relay nuclei, now that is concerned with the sensory component, because the thalamus performs both sensory and motor functions. Now let us see what are the specific relay nuclei for sensory component. Here is the nuclear name, what is the input, what is the where the output goes, and what is the function. We have a lateral geniculate body that receives the input from the optic tract, and it goes to the visual cortex. Purpose is for the vision. The medial geniculate body, it received from the auditory pathway, cochlear tract, and from this cochlear tract, it will go to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, and it is for hearing. It is for hearing. Then ventroposterolateral. So if you are looking at ventroposterolateral nucleus, if you just see that this is ventroposterolateral, and this ventroposterolateral nucleus, this is receiving inputs from the medial lemniscus, then anterior spinothalamic tract, anterior spinothalamic tract, lateral spinothalamic tract. This anterior spinothalamic tract is for a crude touch and temperature. Lateral spinothalamic tract is for pain. So it receives input from the medial lemniscal and anterolateral column sensations. That means posterior column and anterolateral column sensations. These inputs. Then where does it go? It will go to the entire somatosensory cortex, area 312. So now it will process the posterior anterolateral column sensations. All the modalities of somesthetic sensations are processed here. Then ventroposterior medial and ventroposterior intermediate. They are these are known as a trigeminothalamic projections. And these projections also come from the taste buds, and they will be the somatosensory. Where they go, they will go to the somatosensory area in 312 concerning the face, and the gustatory cortex, that is area 43. And you can have all the face or the facial sensations and the taste. This is just for the specific relay nuclei sensory. Now, specific relay nuclei of the motor. What are the motor? You just see that anterior nucleus. This anterior nucleus receives inputs from the mammillary body. So we have seen that weekday gyre. That's a mammillothalamic tract. And the hippocampus. So that forms the mammillothalamic tract, and that would go to the cingulate cortex. So now this is coming from the hippocampus to the mammillary body, and then to the thalamus, and goes to the cingulate cortex. That is the output, and this forms the peptide circuit. The function here, it is the behavior and memory. That is the function. Then ventral anterior group of nuclei of the thalamus, that is concerned with the primarily with the basal ganglia, partly with the lateral cerebellum. This connects the premotor cortex and gives it to the motor cortex. This is for planning, programming, and execution of the voluntary action. The planning, programming, and execution of the voluntary action, the ventral anterior. Ventral lateral is concerned with the lateral cerebellum, and along with that, it is also connected with the medial lemniscal, and then anterior spinothalamic tract and the lateral spinothalamic tract. And these tracts, these are subconscious sensations, or the conscious sensations. They are coming up to orient the posture. You have these sensations reaching, and they will go to the premotor cortex, motor cortex, and somatosensory cortex, because wherein they modify, especially the conscious part of the proprioception. It performs a coordination of the voluntary action, because if you are looking at the ventroanterior nucleus, that is a planning and programming, and here it is connected with the lateral cerebellum. It is a coordination of the voluntary action, and in reference to posture, along with the posture. Now comes the association nuclei. I have divided this is second part, the association nuclei. What are those association nuclei? The first one is the pulvinar. It is a very large mass. So this pulvinar is connected to other nuclei, and it is also connected with the superior colliculus from the midbrain or the ponto midbrain structures or reticular system. it is getting superior colliculus. But superior colliculus, if you are looking at, it receives inputs from the visual occipital cortex. It receives input from the that means the auditory component, auditory pathway, so that there is a orientation. Suppose if there is a sound emerging, I will just move myself to the point where the sound has originated, the direction at which the sound has originated, where superior colliculus plays an important role. So that means it is this pulvinar is connected to the other thalamic nuclei. That means other thalamic nuclei, the ventroposterior, lateral, and other things with a medial and a lateral posterior nucleus, and then to the superior colliculus. This is associated, or it gives information to the parieto-occipito-temporal association area, what is known as a somatosensory association area. So the function is, it is the movement of the eye, head and neck, that is for the pulvinar. That means any damage to the pulvinar may damage the movement of these things. Then lateral posterior, it receives the other thalamic areas, superior colliculus, and from the tectum. And output is going to the same somatosensory association area, parieto-occipito-temporal association area. This is for visual gauging, head and neck orientation, posture, and equilibrium. Lateral posterior. Lateral dorsal, it is connected with the amygdala, olfactory, the hippocampus, anterior spinothalamic tract, lateral spinothalamic tract, and it reaches to the cingulate and other limbic areas. This is for the behavioral assessments and adjustments. The medial nucleus connects to other thalamic nuclei, the amygdala, the olfactory cortex, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and other areas. So the output goes to the prefrontal cortex, the cingulate cortex, the olfactory, and other limbic areas. It is for the learning, memory, and behavior, and the reactions, the emotional reactions we produce. So all these things are with the association. Then we have a non-specific nuclei. Non-specific nuclei are the ventro-anterior, intralaminar, and reticular. The ventro-anterior nucleus, that means the ventral anterior, other thalamic areas, this is connects to the prefrontal cortex. It is a memory and arousal, so the exclusive arousal. So intralaminar is the internal medullary lamina. Internal medullary lamina. So this internal medullary areas, they will receives inputs from other thalamic nuclei, the basal ganglia, reticular system, and the collicular system. I have made the reticular because primarily reticular, because it is receiving inputs from all sensory modalities. So then it will reach to the all cortical areas, layer 1, that is the outer molecular layer, and it is to produce a generalized arousal. Suppose if this is cut, the arousal is not there. That is coma. Reticular nucleus, it receives inputs from the reticular system. The reticular nucleus receives from the reticular system of the midbrain and medulla and pons, and lateral brachial nucleus. And the output is again widespread projection to the reticular system, the pontopeduncular nucleus, the collicular and other nuclei of the brainstem, again that would stimulate those areas and to produce the behavioral responses in terms of the posture and the motor and autonomic alterations. The posture and motor and autonomic posture changes. That is about a non-specific nuclei. Now, to summarize, I have in this particular graph, I have just taken it from this EJ Nipsey, and you just see beautifully it is being organized. On this side, we have the nuclei. This is a Y-shaped. This is the internal laminary or internal medullary lamina. So then this is the anterior nucleus. This is the ventral anterior, ventral lateral, ventral posterior lateral, ventral posterior medial, and pulvinar. These are the nuclei, and this is the median nuclei. This is a median nuclei. This is the anterior. These are lateral. Okay, so now same thing. Anterior here is connected with the mammillary body plus hippocampus. The anterior mammillary body plus hippocampus. The ventral anterior, the basal ganglia. Ventral lateral, superior cerebellar peduncle. Cerebellar peduncle. This is connected with the cerebellar peduncle. The ventrolateral, that is through the cerebellum. This is to the basal ganglia. The ventroposterior lateral and ventroposterior, so that means the medial lemnisc, spinothalamic tract, trigeminothalamic tract. So this is a VPM is for trigeminothalamic tract. So now we have this part, this median part is connected with the superior colliculus. Here, the one which is coming here in the dorsal group of nucleus. And this medial one is connected to the prefrontal cortex, hypothalamus, olfactory, amygdala. That is all the behavior. This is third ventricle. This is where it is approaching. And if you are looking at the medial geniculate body, it is connected with the cochlear nuclei, lateral geniculate body that is connected with the retina. This is in summary about in one vis-a-vis. I have tried to name the nucleus and I'm trying to associate their functionality at one side. Okay, let us, same thing I'm trying to put them here just for a repetition. So you just look at that. This one is a lateral geniculate. This is visual, medial geniculate. This is auditory. This is pulvinar. Pulvinar is connected with the collicular, the anterior spinothalamic tract, the lateral spinothalamic tract. It performs attention, head and neck positioning. Ventral posterior lateral, this is somatosensory. So then ventrolateral, this is connected to cerebellum, that is coordination. This is ventral anterior, that is connected to the basal ganglia, the planning and programming of the motor action. So then this lateral posterior, this is connected with this and the somatosensory association area. So this is attention and assist other thalamic areas, lateral posterior. This is lateral dorsal. This is connected to the limbic system. Along with this, along with the anterior nuclei, it performs aretasis. Now, this is the anterior nucleus. It is the mammillothalamic tract. It is for the emotions. And here we have the reticular system. This is for arousal. This is the internal medullary laminae, this Y. These are the white fibers. They will reach to the entire cortical mantle. That is again for the arousal. And a dorsomedial nucleus, dorsomedial anterior, dorsomedial posterior. This is connected to the olfactory and hypothalamus and visceral. This performs the visceral component of the medial group of nuclei, and this performs the emotion, olfaction, or hippocampal performance. This dorsomedial anterior. So this is about the functions of the different parts of the thalamus. Now, in the cerebral cortex, I am just trying to put the thalamic nuclei. So this is the brain. Here is the lateral sulcus. This is the central sulcus. So this is a ventroposterior lateral nucleus. So where we said that somatosensory association area 1. So this is where it is released. And this is ventroposterior medial. This is the face and the gustatory ventroposterior medial. So this is a medial geniculate body, that is auditory. And this is for pulvinar. This is pulvinar. This is the association cortex that tries to focus the attention or a visual gaze. So then this is the lateral posterior and pulvinar. So this is somatosensory association area. That is lateral posterior pulvinar. And lateral geniculate body, here it is the occipital cortex. Then medial part is to the prefrontal cortex. Then ventrolateral, Ventrolateral is for the cerebellar to the premotor cortex, ventral anterior basal ganglia to the premotor cortex, and then the entire connections. The same thing here in a sagittal section. You can just see that this is the ventro-anterior. This is where it is represented. Ventrolateral cerebellum. This is basal ganglia. This is somatosensory area. This is a pulvinar connection. This is a pulvinar connection. This is a lateral geniculate body. That is a visual connection. And this is a medial midline. These things. This part is the part of the prefrontal and the limbic system. The internal laminar nucleus, internal laminar nucleus, and the medial nucleus, where this forms the mammillothalamic tract and then to the cingulate cortex. So these are the Thalamo-Cortical relations. So now, coming back, what are the various disorders we can anticipate for thalamus? Any damage to those nuclei will result in the deficiency of the particular specific sensations. Suppose if there is a damage to the medial geniculate body, auditory sensation is impaired. If there is a damage to the lateral geniculate body, that is a part of the thalamus, the visual sensation is lost. Maybe again loss of the visual sensation, maybe hemianopia or whatever the mode, how much the involvement of the lateral geniculate body is there. And then we have VPL, the ventroposterolateral nucleus of the thalamus is lost. All the medial lemniscal and pain fibers are lost. So like that, the specific areas and the specific sensations are lost. Similarly, associated with the ventral anterior thalamus is damaged, it is similar to the basal ganglia disorders, because the basal ganglia outputs or the inhibitory outputs reaching or modulating the thalamo-cortical projections, and these inhibitory or whatever the outputs reaching the premotor and motor cortex, they will not be able to produce the motor actions properly. There will be motor abnormalities. So if you are looking at the again to part of the medial nucleus and the ventral anterior nucleus, they are for attention and they are for memory, especially the Korsakoff syndrome. Korsakoff syndrome. It's a chronic memory disorder caused by severe deficiency of a thiamine, vitamin B1, seen commonly in chronic alcoholics. And it is due to the degeneration of the mammillothalamic tract. This is also known as a Witt-D-Azyre. So this is about the memory. There is a loss of memory. Then there is a cognitive deficiency. That means not able to store the memory, perform the actions, because the prefrontal cortex is involved. Then because it is the thalamus is involved in the wakeful state or the sleep wakeful state, if these connections are lost, the person goes into a sleep or a coma. I will not say sleep. He will not have that wakeful state. He will never be able to wake if it is cut. So that is a sleep wakefulness abnormalities seen in the thalamic disorders. And there is what is called a thalamic syndrome. Thalamic syndrome. And now I look into this thalamic syndrome little more, because it's a condition in which the individual becomes hypersensitive to pain, exaggerated by heat or a cold or a stressful reactions. This is also known as a thalamic pain syndrome. The pain experienced by the patient is centralized pain. Centralized means it is nothing to do with the periphery. It is in the center, in the thalamus or in the nerves. It's a centralized pain, and it is neuropathic. That means originating from the neurons in the thalamus, and is associated with temperature changes. That means they will stimulate or trigger the changes. And these patients will often see the increased sensitivity of the responses. That means the pain fibers are hyperalgesic. They respond even with a small subthreshold stimuli. Sometimes they would be able to, they will be able to produce the painful reaction from other sensations. The allodynia is a condition in which the normal touch sensation now will produce the pain. It may happen to us. Thalamic pain syndrome is an outcome of why it is due to. It is due to the cerebrovascular accident wherein the thalamus nucleus is necrotized. Treatment options are very limited. Alternative and integrative approaches to treatment are recommended to help to improve the pain and quality of life. So usually the pharmacological options include neuropathic pain medications and opioid analgesics. So that means opiates, the morphine-like drugs are given, and other pain medications which prevent the neuropathy. Then more invasive treatment include a deep brain stimulation. So that means you introduce electrodes and stimulate these areas, or do surgery, that is ablation, or do neuromodulation. All these things are more invasive. These are experimental type. Prognosis remains guarded. Guarded means is not good. The providers must keep thalamic pain syndrome on their differential diagnosis for all patients who have suffered from cerebrovascular accidents. Cerebrovascular accidents, you just see or look for thalamic pain syndrome, and for any of those complaints of the neuropathic pain. That is about thalamic pain syndrome. Now, summary of the functions of the thalamus. The all sensory modalities relates to specific cortical areas except olfactory. Primitive sensory processing. So this one, so that means a part of the sensory processing is done in the thalamus. Suppose if I remove the entire cerebral matrix, so in that case, the person is able to feel the sensation or uneasiness, but he will not be able to define it precisely as we define. So that means a primitive sensory processing is present in the thalamus, especially the pain and the thermal sensations. These are non-discriminatory sensations. Discriminatory sensations are those who are coming from the posterior column. Then spatial sense and fixation of a gaze. The spatial sense is a posture. The fixation of gaze is a posture, head and neck movement in reference to a particular object. So these are pulvinar and collicular functions. Controlling the head and neck movements in relation to other sensory stimuli. That is again a pulvinar and collicular functions. Arousal and a conscious state. That means a sleep-wakeful state. That is from the internal medullary lamina and external medullary lamina and the reticular nucleus. Emotions and behavioral responses. Anterior thalamus and a medial thalamus. Part of the lateral dorsal thalamus. The planning and initiation of movement, the ventral anterior part of thalamus. Coordination of the movement with the lateral cerebellum, ventral lateral part of the cerebellum. So then anterior part of the nucleus is involved in the storage of the memory, consolidation of the memory in association with the emotion. The mammillothalamic tract, what I talked about, the Pepage circuit. The medial group of nuclei are responsible for the motivation, enthusiasm, the emotions, and related to all your inspirations. So that means the inquisitiveness and the visceral homeostatic functions via the hypothalamus. The visceral and homeostatic, that is the medial thalamic nucleus. The centromedian part governs the emotional component of pain because it is connected with the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. Assignments: draw a neat labeled diagram of a thalamus depicting various nuclei and their connections and functions. Then write short notes on the following: anterior nucleus of thalamus, Pepage circuit, Vic D. Azaire, that is a mammillothalamic tract, association nuclei of the thalamus, I have explained. Thalamic nuclei related to the sensory projections. Thalamic nuclei related to the motor projections. The ventral anterior or ventral lateral nucleus. Thalamic nuclei or thalamic syndrome mention the different nuclei of thalamus. These are two parts. Thalamic syndrome is one, mention different nuclei of thalamus. Just mention the name of the nuclei. Connections and functions of the medial nucleus of thalamus. Connections and functions of the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of thalamus. The connections and functions of the ventral anterior nucleus of thalamus. The connections and functions of the ventral lateral nucleus of thalamus. The connections and functions of the pulvinar nucleus. The connections and functions of the non-specific nuclei of thalamus. And a brief note on Korsakoff syndrome. Okay, these are the assignments. You should try to put them together, so you will all be happy with the thalamus. So in the next lecture, we look into the receptors, pathway, processing of the proprioception. Okay, thank you.